There's always one person in the family, one person in the church, one person in the environment who feels different, not better, not perfect, just different. You were the one who questioned things everyone else accepted. You were the one who felt deeply while others acted numb. You were the one who wanted peace in places addicted to chaos. And because of that, you became misunderstood. People called you too emotional, too sensitive, too spiritual, too quiet, too intense. But what if your difference was never a flaw? What if God allowed you to feel uncomfortable in dysfunctional environments because your soul was never designed to become one with them? What if the reason you could not fully adapt to toxic cycles was because heaven marked you to break them? Some people inherit patterns, but some people are born to end them. And the tragedy is this: the person chosen to bring healing is often the one treated like the problem. Because dysfunction becomes angry when someone carries the light of awareness, because the moment one person begins to see clearly, everything hidden inside the environment starts revealing itself, and that is where the real battle begins. In many families, pain becomes normal, silence becomes normal, manipulation becomes normal, emotional neglect becomes normal, spiritual confusion becomes normal. People stop asking if something is healthy. They only ask if it is familiar. And after years of living inside unhealthy environments, dysfunction no longer looks dangerous to people. It starts looking ordinary. People laugh through pain they never healed from. They hide trauma behind personality. They call emotional wounds just the way we are. They normalize anger, distance, control, and emotional coldness because those things have existed for so long that nobody remembers what peace even feels like anymore. And when you are the one who notices the brokenness, people become uncomfortable around you because awareness threatens denial. Your presence alone starts exposing things others spent years trying not to confront. You started noticing things others ignored. You noticed how people smiled in public but cried in private. You noticed how anger passed from generation to generation. You noticed how trauma disguised itself as tradition. You noticed how people used religion to hide pain they refused to heal from. You noticed how some homes looked stable on the outside while silently collapsing emotionally on the inside. You saw the tension in conversations, the hidden resentment, the emotional distance between people who claimed to love each other. And while everyone else learned how to adapt to the dysfunction, your soul kept resisting it. Deep inside, something felt wrong. Not because you hated your family, not because you thought you were perfect, but because your spirit could not fully agree with the darkness surrounding you. And late at night, when nobody else seemed bothered by the chaos, your mind kept asking questions. Why does love here feel painful? Why does everyone avoid honesty? Why do people pretend everything is okay when it clearly is not? Why does truth make people angry? Why do I feel alone even around people? And deep inside, your spirit kept whispering, this is not how life is supposed to be. But instead of listening to your concern, many people attacked your sensitivity. Because wounded people often feel exposed by someone who carries emotional awareness, people who have spent years suppressing pain do not always welcome truth. Sometimes they resent the person who reminds them that healing is necessary. So instead of asking why you were hurting, they criticized the way you felt. They told you that you think too much, feel too much, care too much, pray too much, question too much. But the reality was deeper than that. You were carrying the emotional weight of things others learned to ignore. And psychologically, this happens often inside dysfunctional systems. The person who becomes conscious of the brokenness usually becomes the problem in the eyes of everyone else. Not because they are wrong, but because they interrupt the comfort of denial. Families sometimes protect unhealthy patterns more fiercely than they protect truth, because truth forces change, and change threatens identities people built around survival. That is why spiritually awakened people often feel isolated. Your soul begins to outgrow environments your body still lives inside, and that creates internal conflict. Part of you wants connection, but another part of you can no longer pretend. You begin feeling emotionally homeless, too aware to stay asleep, but still surrounded by people who refuse to wake up. The Bible shows this pattern repeatedly. Joseph was hated because he carried vision. His brothers rejected him not because he was evil, but because his presence revealed something different about him. Jeremiah was rejected because he spoke truth people did not want to hear. The same voice sent by God became the voice people tried to silence. David was overlooked before he was chosen. While others focused on appearance, God saw something hidden inside him, and even Jesus Christ was misunderstood by the very people he came to heal. The world often rejects what heaven sends first, because light exposes darkness before it heals it. Sometimes God marks people differently long before others understand why. And maybe that is why your journey has felt so lonely. Because being chosen to break patterns often means you must first survive the pain of seeing what everyone else refuses to acknowledge, and eventually, that awareness begins changing you from the inside. Because once a person truly sees the dysfunction clearly, they can never fully return to being the version of themselves that ignored it. And that is where the next stage of the battle begins. One of the hardest psychological realities is this. When you begin healing, you no longer emotionally match unhealthy environments. Your spirit changes, your mind changes, your desires change, and suddenly, the conversations feel empty. The chaos feels exhausting. The emotional games feel unbearable. Things you once tolerated now drain you. Places that once felt normal now feel heavy. Certain relationships begin feeling emotionally unsafe, even if you cannot fully explain why. Because healing changes what your soul can emotionally survive inside, you begin craving peace instead of drama, truth instead of pretending, depth instead of performance. You stop finding comfort in gossip. You stop enjoying fake connections. You stop forcing yourself to laugh through pain just to fit in. And that change confuses people. Because unhealthy environments often depend on people staying emotionally asleep. The moment you begin growing, you unintentionally disrupt the system around you. And this transformation can become deeply lonely. Not because you hate people, but because your soul no longer feels connected to the version of life you used to tolerate. You start feeling emotionally distant from conversations that once entertained you. You become quieter because your spirit is processing things more deeply. You withdraw from certain environments because your nervous system is tired of surviving constant emotional tension. And people notice. Some people will accuse you of changing. Others will say you think you are better than everyone. But what they do not understand is this. Healing changes your emotional appetite. The same way a healed body rejects poison, a healing soul begins rejecting emotional toxicity. But wounded environments often interpret boundaries as rejection. So when you stop participating in dysfunction, people sometimes become offended by your growth, not because you attack them, but because your healing reminds them of the pain they avoid confronting within themselves. And psychologically, this creates an internal battle inside you. Because part of you wants peace, while another part still fears losing connection. You start asking yourself difficult questions. Am I becoming distant? Am I wrong for protecting my peace? Why do I feel guilty for changing? Why does growth feel so lonely? And many healing people secretly struggle with this guilt because they spent years being emotionally conditioned to prioritize everyone else's comfort over their own well-being. So the moment they start choosing peace, they feel selfish. The moment they create boundaries, they feel cruel. The moment they stop tolerating emotional chaos, they feel like the problem. But healing is not pride. Healing is awakening. And awakening is painful because God begins exposing everything your soul can no longer survive inside. The Holy Spirit has a way of disturbing false peace. What looked normal before suddenly feels spiritually heavy. What once entertained you now leaves your spirit empty. What once felt acceptable now feels emotionally destructive. Because God will often disrupt your comfort before He transforms your life. And this stage is confusing. Because externally, people may think you are simply changing, But internally, an entire war is happening inside your soul. You are grieving old versions of yourself, old habits, old emotional attachments, old identities you created just to survive. And psychologically, healing often feels like isolation before it feels like freedom. Because before you can build healthy connections, God sometimes separates you from unhealthy dependence. That separation hurts. There are nights you feel misunderstood, moments you feel emotionally homeless, times you wonder why nobody seems to understand the battle happening inside you. You pray more, but still feel lonely. You seek God, but still feel emotionally exhausted. You try to heal, but still carry invisible sadness. And sometimes the deepest pain is realizing that people were more comfortable with the broken version of you than the healed version becoming stronger. Because the broken version was easier to control, easier to predict, easier to keep trapped inside unhealthy cycles. But healing people eventually realize something painful. Not everyone connected to you is connected to your growth. Some people only knew how to relate to your wounds, and the moment God starts healing those wounds, the relationship itself begins changing. That is why spiritual awakening can feel isolating. Because God is not only changing your behavior, He is changing your discernment. You begin sensing emotional manipulation faster. You begin recognizing hidden toxicity quicker. You begin noticing how certain environments affect your mental and spiritual health, and what once felt normal now feels unbearable. Sometimes the anxiety you felt was not weakness. Sometimes your spirit was warning you that your environment was damaging your soul. Not every discomfort is spiritual attack. Sometimes it is emotional exhaustion. Sometimes it is unresolved grief. Sometimes it is years of suppressed pain finally reaching the surface. And sometimes it is the weight of carrying generations of unspoken trauma inside one's soul. The pressure of being the one who sees clearly, the one who feels deeply, the one trying to heal what others normalized. Because healing does not only reveal pain, eventually it reveals patterns. And once God opens your eyes to the patterns operating through generations, you begin understanding that your battle was never just personal. There are patterns that travel through generations silently. Cycles of fear, cycles of addiction, cycles of emotional absence, cycles of abuse, cycles of shame, cycles of spiritual emptiness. And the dangerous thing about destructive patterns is this: most of them do not begin loudly. They begin quietly, slowly, repeated over years until brokenness starts feeling normal. A child grows up in an emotionally cold home and later struggles to express love. Someone raised around constant anger begins believing aggression is strength. A person who never experienced healthy affection starts confusing manipulation with care. And over time, pain stops looking like pain. It starts looking like personality. That is why many people unconsciously repeat the very things that once wounded them. Because pain that is not healed becomes inherited behavior. Psychology calls this generational conditioning. The human mind learns through repetition. What people repeatedly experience becomes emotionally familiar to them. Even unhealthy environments can become psychologically comfortable simply because they are familiar. People inherit survival mechanisms, defense patterns, fear responses, emotional habits, and without awareness, one wounded generation quietly shapes the next. But spiritually, many believers recognize something deeper happening beneath the surface. Not only emotional conditioning, but destructive cycles traveling through families for years like invisible chains, patterns that keep reproducing themselves because nobody stops long enough to confront them. One generation hides emotions. The next generation struggles with emotional connection. One generation suffers abandonment. The next develops deep fear of rejection. One generation normalizes silence. The next suffers inwardly, but never speaks honestly. The faces change. The years change. But the pain keeps moving. And eventually, entire family systems begin functioning around survival instead of healing. People stop asking, "How do we become whole?" and start asking, How do we avoid pain long enough to survive another day? That is how dysfunction becomes generational, not because people enjoy suffering, but because wounded people often pass down what they never learned to heal. And then, something unusual happens. One person rises with a different spirit. One person feels disturbed by what everyone else accepts. One person refuses to emotionally go numb. One person starts asking dangerous questions. Why are we living like this? Why are we hiding pain? Why do we normalize suffering? Why does nobody heal? Why does truth make people uncomfortable? Why are we protecting dysfunction instead of confronting it? That person becomes dangerous to the pattern, not because they are rebellious, but because awareness threatens everything dysfunction depends on. Patterns survive through unconscious repetition. But awareness breaks agreement. The moment you became conscious of the dysfunction, the cycle started losing power over you. The moment you stopped excusing toxic behavior, something shifted spiritually inside your mind. The moment you realized this pain existed before me, you also began realizing it does not have to continue after me. And that realization changes everything. Because now you are no longer unconsciously participating in the cycle. You begin noticing emotional manipulation faster. You begin recognizing unhealthy behavior more clearly. You begin feeling spiritually uncomfortable in environments you once tolerated. And this awakening becomes exhausting. Because awareness creates internal conflict. Part of you still loves the people around you, but another part of you can now see the damage clearly. You begin grieving things nobody else seems willing to acknowledge. You grieve broken communication, emotional distance, suppressed pain, false peace, generational wounds hidden beneath smiles and religious appearances, and spiritually, this stage becomes warfare. Because once God opens your eyes, darkness no longer feels invisible. You begin seeing how fear controls people, how pride prevents healing, how trauma shapes personalities, how silence protects dysfunction, how wounded people unintentionally wound others. And the deeper your awareness grows, the harder it becomes to pretend everything is okay. That is why your journey feels spiritual. Because breaking patterns is not just emotional work. It is warfare against everything that tried to imprison generations before you. It is fighting mindsets that kept families emotionally trapped. It is confronting lies people became comfortable believing. It is refusing to become the next carrier of inherited pain. And that battle comes with resistance. Because unhealthy systems do not celebrate the person trying to bring awareness, they resist them. The moment you stop cooperating with dysfunction, people begin noticing your difference. Some become uncomfortable around your honesty. Others misunderstand your boundaries. Some mock your sensitivity. Others criticize your growth because your healing exposes what they avoid confronting within themselves. And this is where many people become confused, because the very qualities God placed inside them become the same qualities people attack the most. And eventually, you begin realizing something painful but powerful. Sometimes people mock what heaven has already marked for purpose. Many people mocked your difference because your presence exposed their comfort with dysfunction. Light does that. When someone begins walking in truth, hidden things become visible. That is why spiritually awakened people often feel rejected. Not because they are evil, but because truth makes sleeping souls uncomfortable. Your presence started revealing things people spent years trying to ignore. Not because you were attacking them, not because you thought you were better, but because awareness naturally exposes what denial tries to hide. And wounded environments often become defensive when someone carries emotional honesty. People who have normalized pain do not always celebrate healing. Sometimes they resist it. Because your growth silently confronts their avoidance. Your peace exposes their chaos. Your honesty exposes their pretending. Your healing exposes their wounds. And many people do not realize this psychologically. When someone begins changing internally, everyone connected to them feels the shift emotionally, especially people who benefited from their brokenness. The version of you that stayed silent was easier to manage. The version of you that tolerated disrespect was easier to control. The version of you that abandoned yourself to keep others comfortable made people feel safe. But once God starts healing you, you stop cooperating with things that destroy your soul. And suddenly, people begin misunderstanding your transformation. Your boundaries look like rebellion to controlling people. Your quietness looks like pride to emotionally immature people. Your discernment looks like judgment to people who fear accountability. That is why spiritually awakened people often feel isolated, because growth changes your relationship with environments that depend on dysfunction, and many people mock what they secretly do not understand. Throughout Scripture, God repeatedly chose people who looked strange before their purpose became visible. Noah looked foolish until the rain came. People laughed at the ark because they could not see what God had already revealed to him. Moses was doubted before deliverance happened. The same man people questioned became the vessel God used to lead others out of bondage. Elijah felt isolated while carrying God's voice. There were moments he felt completely alone because truth often feels lonely in spiritually dry environments. Even Jesus Christ was mocked, rejected, and misunderstood. The Son of God himself experienced rejection from people who could not recognize heaven standing in front of them. And this reveals something powerful. Being misunderstood does not always mean you are wrong. Sometimes it means your spirit no longer matches the environment around you. Sometimes God separates people emotionally before he elevates them spiritually. And that separation hurts, because humans naturally crave belonging. We want to feel accepted, seen, understood, connected, but some forms of belonging require self-betrayal. Some environments only accept the version of you that stays spiritually asleep. The moment you start becoming emotionally healthy, the connection changes. And psychologically, this creates painful confusion inside you, because part of you still wants love from people who only understood the wounded version of you. You start questioning yourself. Why do I suddenly feel disconnected? Why do certain relationships feel heavy now? Why does healing feel so lonely? Why do I feel emotionally separated even around familiar people? And the painful truth is this: growth creates distance between you and environments that cannot grow with you. Not everyone assigned to your past is assigned to your future. Some people were only connected to the survival version of you, the fearful version, the broken version, the version that tolerated emotional pain silently. But God is not calling you to remain emotionally imprisoned just to maintain unhealthy connections. And sometimes he removes you before an environment completely destroys your identity. Because prolonged dysfunction slowly changes people. It teaches them to suppress themselves, shrink themselves, silence themselves. Over time, many people become actors inside their own lives, pretending to be okay, pretending not to hurt, pretending not to feel exhausted. And your soul became tired of pretending, exhausted from performing peace while internally battling pain, exhausted from smiling through emotional confusion, exhausted from shrinking your spirit just to fit environments that could never hold who God created you to become. And eventually, your spirit reached a breaking point, because there comes a moment when the pain of staying the same becomes heavier than the fear of changing. And that is often the moment God begins transforming suffering into purpose, because many people do not realize this until later. The very pain that isolated you was also preparing you for something greater. One of the deepest spiritual mysteries is this: the pain that almost broke you often reveals the purpose hidden inside you. At first, suffering feels meaningless, the rejection feels personal, the loneliness feels unbearable, the betrayal feels unfair, the emotional exhaustion feels endless. You ask God questions and nobody else hears. Why did this happen to me? Why have I always felt different? Why does my life feel so emotionally heavy? Why do I keep losing people while trying to heal? Why does growth hurt this much? And for a long time, it feels like your pain is only destroying you. But eventually, something deeper begins happening inside your spirit. You start realizing that pain was revealing things comfort never could. The rejection taught you discernment. The loneliness taught you intimacy with God. The emotional battles taught you compassion. The betrayal taught you wisdom. The environments that wounded you also revealed what your soul truly needed. Because sometimes God allows certain experiences not to destroy your identity, but to uncover it. And that changes the way you see your story. You begin understanding that your sensitivity was not weakness. Your deep emotions were not failure. Your constant inner questioning was not instability. God was awakening awareness inside you. Because people chosen to heal deeply often feel deeply first. And the painful truth is this: the people who carry the greatest emotional wisdom are often the people who suffered in silence the longest. Not because God enjoys watching people hurt, but because brokenness exposes realities most people never stop long enough to notice. Pain slows people down. Pain reveals hidden wounds. Pain exposes false foundations. Pain forces honesty. And spiritually, many people only begin seeking God deeply after life strips away the illusions they depended on. That is why some of your darkest seasons became the birthplace of your awakening. You prayed differently after heartbreak. You saw people differently after betrayal. You understood suffering differently after emotional exhaustion. The pain changed your perception. And while others were trying to numb themselves, your spirit was slowly becoming more aware. What others used to wound you, God used to awaken you. Not immediately, not easily, but gradually. Because God has a way of turning wounds into wisdom when a person refuses to let suffering harden their heart. Some people become bitter after pain, but others become awakened. And often the difference is whether the pain pushed them away from truth or deeper into it. Because some people are not called merely to survive environments, they are called to transform them. You were not meant to simply adapt to brokenness. You were meant to recognize it, confront it, heal from it, and eventually become proof that freedom is possible. The reason your spirit kept resisting darkness is because your identity was tied to healing. Even when you tried to ignore the dysfunction, something inside you kept reacting to it. Your soul would not fully settle inside environments that damaged your spirit, because heaven placed a different assignment on your life. You were not born to continue the pattern. You were born to confront it. And confronting cycles is exhausting, especially when you are the first person in generations trying to become emotionally aware. You begin carrying battles nobody else understands. You grieve things others minimize. You notice patterns others deny. You feel spiritual heaviness others ignore. And there are moments this journey feels overwhelming. Moments you question yourself. Moments you wonder if healing is even worth the loneliness it creates. Moments you feel guilty for changing while others stay the same. Because growth creates emotional separation, not always physically, but internally. You begin realizing you cannot think the same way anymore, cannot tolerate the same behaviors anymore, cannot emotionally survive the same environments anymore. And that realization creates grief. Because part of healing is mourning the version of yourself that once accepted less than what God wanted for your life. There are moments you will feel torn between who you were and who you are becoming. Part of you still longs for familiarity, but another part knows familiarity almost destroyed you. And psychologically, this creates tension inside the mind, because humans naturally crave comfort, even when the comfort is unhealthy. That is why many people return to toxic environments, not because the environments are good, but because they are familiar. But your spirit kept resisting, even when it was painful, even when it was lonely, even when nobody understood the transformation happening inside you. Because something deeper was taking place. God was not only healing your wounds, He was rebuilding your mind. And eventually, the greatest battle would no longer happen around you. It would begin happening inside you. One of the greatest battles happens internally. Not every war leaves visible scars. Some of the deepest battles happen silently inside the mind, inside the heart, inside the soul. And for people called to break patterns, the hardest fight is often the internal conflict between who they used to be and who God is calling them to become. You begin hearing two voices. One voice says, "Stay the same so people accept you. Do not change too much. Keep everyone comfortable." Go back to what is familiar. Do not make people uncomfortable with your growth. But the other voice whispers something deeper. You cannot keep abandoning your soul to make others comfortable. You cannot heal while pretending to be broken. You cannot hear God clearly while constantly betraying yourself. You were not created to stay emotionally trapped forever. And this creates emotional warfare. Because psychologically, humans fear rejection. We fear losing connection, losing familiarity, losing approval. The human mind naturally wants safety and belonging. Even unhealthy environments can feel emotionally safe simply because they are familiar. That is why many people remain stuck in cycles that hurt them, not because they enjoy suffering, but because the unknown feels terrifying. Healing requires entering unfamiliar emotional territory, and unfamiliarity often feels unsafe before it feels freeing. But spiritually, your soul fears bondage more than rejection. Deep inside, something keeps resisting the old version of your life. Even when you try to go backward emotionally, your spirit feels restless. You try to ignore the awareness God gave you, but your soul can no longer sleep comfortably inside dysfunction. Because once God opens your eyes, pretending becomes exhausting. And eventually, you reach a painful crossroads internally. Will you betray your healing to maintain false peace? Or will you obey the deeper calling God placed inside you? That decision changes everything, because choosing healing often means grieving old identities. The version of yourself that tolerated emotional pain silently. The version that kept shrinking to fit unhealthy environments. The version that stayed quiet just to avoid conflict. And psychologically, this transition feels confusing, because part of you misses the familiarity of the old life, even though the old life was hurting you. That is the strange reality of emotional bondage. People can become attached to the very things destroying them. Pain becomes identity, chaos becomes comfort, brokenness becomes predictable, and after years of surviving dysfunction, peace can actually feel unfamiliar. Silence feels strange, healthy love feels suspicious, emotional honesty feels uncomfortable. Because the mind adapts to whatever it experiences repeatedly. That is why healing is not only spiritual, it is psychological transformation. God is not only changing your behavior, He is renewing the way you think, the way you see yourself, the way you understand love, the way you respond to pain, the way you interpret your worth. And this inner transformation creates spiritual warfare inside the mind. Because old mental patterns do not disappear quietly. Fear fights back, shame fights back, trauma fights back, negative thinking fights back. You may begin hearing thoughts like, what if I never change? What if people leave me? What if I am becoming too different? What if I lose myself completely? And spiritually, the enemy often attacks the mind first, because if your thinking stays trapped, your life stays trapped. That is why Scripture says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Transformation always begins internally before it becomes visible externally. Before your environment changes, your thinking changes. Before your life changes, your perspective changes. Before your future changes, your identity changes. And this process takes time. Because healing is not simply removing pain, it is learning how to live differently after surviving it. And many people underestimate how difficult this stage becomes. You may look calm externally while internally fighting intense emotional battles. Battles against self-doubt, against fear, against guilt, against the temptation to return to familiar dysfunction just to feel emotionally connected again. There are moments you will feel divided inside yourself. One part of you wants freedom, another part fears what freedom will cost. One part wants healing, another part still seeks approval from people attached to your brokenness, and that tension can feel exhausting. But slowly, God begins strengthening something inside you. Your discernment grows sharper, your self-awareness grows deeper, your emotional tolerance for dysfunction becomes weaker. You begin recognizing that many of the things people criticized about you were never weaknesses at all. They were signs that your spirit was different from the environment surrounding you. And eventually, you begin realizing something powerful. Maybe you were never too different to begin with. Maybe you were never too much. Maybe you simply carried a soul that refused to normalize destruction. Maybe your sensitivity was discernment. Maybe your emotional depth was awareness. Maybe your discomfort was spiritual intelligence. Maybe your separation was divine protection. For years, people may have made you feel like something was wrong with you. Too emotional, too quiet, too deep, too sensitive, too serious. But maybe the real reason you struggled to fit in was because your spirit could see things other people ignored. You noticed when people were hurting behind fake smiles. You noticed unhealthy behavior others called normal. You felt uncomfortable in places where people constantly pretended everything was okay. And because you felt deeply, you thought something was wrong with you. But feeling deeply is not weakness. Sometimes it is awareness. Some people can sit inside toxic environments for years and never question them. But your spirit kept reacting. Why? Because your soul was not created to become comfortable with emotional darkness. That is why certain conversations drained you. Certain people exhausted you. Certain environments made your spirit feel heavy. God was protecting something inside you. And many times, what people call being different is actually the beginning of spiritual awakening. Because awakened people see life differently. They think differently, feel differently, respond differently. Not because they are better than others, but because their spirit refuses to stay asleep. The very traits people criticized may be the evidence that God placed something uncommon inside you. Your compassion, your emotional depth, your desire for peace, your hunger for truth, your discomfort with fake love and hidden pain. Those things were not accidents. God often places deep awareness inside people He wants to use for healing. Not everyone is assigned to continue a bloodline's emotional habits. Some are chosen to interrupt them. Some are chosen to become the first person who heals, the first person who speaks honestly, the first person who breaks unhealthy cycles, the first person who chooses peace over dysfunction. And interruption always creates resistance before it creates freedom. Because when one person changes, everything around them begins reacting to that change. People may misunderstand you. Some may distance themselves from you. Others may criticize the boundaries you create. But that does not mean your growth is wrong. Sometimes resistance is confirmation that transformation is happening. And slowly, you begin realizing this journey was never only about your own healing. God was preparing your life to become a source of healing for others too. Because healed people do not only change themselves, they change the atmosphere around them. God does not merely want to heal you privately. He wants healing to flow through your life, through your words, through your compassion, through your awareness, through your prayers, through your example. Because real healing never stops with one person. When God heals one life deeply, other people begin healing too. The peace you build inside yourself can change your family. The wisdom you gained through pain can help someone else survive their darkest season. The love you learned after suffering can become the thing that helps another person feel seen and understood. That is how healing spreads. Not only through preaching, not only through advice, but through the way you live. People notice when someone carries peace in a world full of chaos. People notice when someone responds with wisdom instead of bitterness. People notice when someone chooses honesty, kindness, and emotional maturity after surviving pain. And many times, they may never say it out loud, but your healing becomes hope for others. Because when one person heals, future generations suffer less. One healed mind can change an entire family story. One person who learns healthy love can stop years of emotional damage from continuing. One person who chooses honesty can break generations of silence. One person who becomes emotionally aware can change the atmosphere inside an entire home. And spiritually, this matters deeply, because darkness survives where pain stays hidden. But healing brings light into places where people suffered silently for years. That is why your journey has felt so heavy at times. You are not only fighting for yourself, you are fighting against patterns that affected people long before you were born. And sometimes the people called to carry healing experience the deepest battles first, not because God abandoned them, but because their life carries purpose beyond what they currently understand. Because the enemy fights hardest against people carrying generational freedom. People who stay trapped in dysfunction rarely threaten darkness, but people who begin healing, growing, and awakening spiritually become dangerous to destructive cycles. That is why you faced resistance, why your mind battled confusion, why your spirit often felt tired, why your journey sometimes felt lonely. There was a deeper battle connected to your growth. But hear this clearly. Your struggle was not meaningless. God saw every moment, every tear, every lonely night, every silent prayer, every emotional battle nobody else understood. None of it was wasted. Even the seasons that almost broke you were shaping something inside you. Strength, wisdom, discernment, compassion, spiritual depth. You were becoming someone capable of carrying light into dark places without becoming consumed by them. Someone who understands pain without becoming controlled by it. Someone who can help others heal because they know what it feels like to suffer silently. Someone who can recognize brokenness while still carrying hope. And slowly, you begin realizing something powerful. Maybe being different was never a curse. Maybe it was a sign that God set your life apart for something greater all along. So if you always felt different, if you always felt disconnected from unhealthy patterns, if your soul kept longing for deeper truth, maybe you were never the problem. Maybe you were the interruption heaven sent into the pattern. Maybe God allowed you to see what others ignored because your life was meant to bring healing where pain had lived for years. The cycle called you rebellious, but God called you awakened. People called you strange, but God called you set apart. People may not have understood your heart. They may not have understood your sensitivity, your deep thinking, your emotional struggles, your desire for peace and honesty. But not everything different is wrong. Sometimes the people who feel the most out of place are the people God is preparing to change things. They thought you were weak because you felt deeply, but your depth was proof your heart was still alive. While others became emotionally numb, you still cared. You still questioned things. You still searched for truth. You still wanted healing. And that matters more than you realize. Because many people spend their whole lives adapting to brokenness without ever confronting it. But your spirit kept resisting it, even when it was painful, even when it made you feel alone, even when people misunderstood you. And maybe now you finally understand why. You were not born to repeat inherited pain. You were born to become evidence that healing is possible, evidence that a person can survive darkness without becoming consumed by it, evidence that generational pain can end, evidence that God can restore a wounded mind, a broken heart, and a tired soul. Your life carries meaning. Your journey carries purpose. Even the painful parts of your story were shaping something inside you. Strength, wisdom, discernment, compassion. And one day, the same people who misunderstood your growth may finally understand why you had to become different. Because the very difference people rejected will become the reason others finally find freedom. The peace you fought for will help someone else heal. The truth you discovered will help someone else awaken. The healing God started inside you will reach farther than you can currently see. So do not hate the part of yourself that refused to fit into dysfunction. That may be the very part God chose to use the most, because the different one was never cursed. The different one was chosen.